Picture this. December 1st, 1955. A tired seamstress boards a bus in Montgomery, Alabama after a long day's work. In our timeline, what she does next changes American history forever. But what if, in that crucial moment, fear wins? What if Rosa Parks stands up, moves to the back, and goes home to a quiet dinner? No boycott, no movement, no spark. Tonight, we're exploring the butterfly effect of a single moment of courage that almost never happened, and what our world might look like if it didn't. This isn't just about one woman on one bus. This is about how fragile progress really is, and how close we came to living in a very different America. Let's rewind. Before we dive into our alternate timeline, you need to understand who Rosa Parks really was, because the myth and the reality are two very different things. Rosa Louise Macaulay was born on February 4, 1913, in Tuskegee, Alabama. Her early life was defined by the brutality of Jim Crow, a system designed to humiliate, disenfranchise, and terrorize Black Americans at every turn. Her grandfather kept a shotgun by the door, watching for Ku Klux Klan riders. Young Rosa would lie awake at night, listening for their horses. This wasn't ancient history. This was Rosa's childhood. She married Raymond Parks in 1932, a barber who was already deeply involved in civil rights activism. Raymond was working on the Scottsboro Boys case, risking his life to defend 9 Black teenagers falsely accused of assault. Rosa didn't just marry an activist, she became one. By the 1940s, she joined the NAACP, eventually becoming the secretary of the Montgomery chapter. Here's what most people get wrong. Rosa Parks wasn't just a tired seamstress who spontaneously decided to take a stand. She was a trained activist. She'd attended workshops on civil disobedience at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee just months before that December evening. She'd been working with NAACP leader E.D. Nixon, strategizing about how to challenge Montgomery's bus segregation laws. The Montgomery buses were a powder keg waiting to explode. 3/4 of the passengers were Black, but they were forced to pay at the front, exit, and re-enter through the back door. Sometimes the bus would drive off before they could reboard. They had to sit in the back section, but even those seats could be taken away if a white passenger needed them. In March 1955, 9 months before Rosa's famous refusal, a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Cole then had refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. She was arrested, dragged off kicking and screaming. But the NAACP decided not to rally around her case. Claudette was young, unmarried, and pregnant. They needed someone respectable to be the face of their challenge. They were waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect case. Now we arrive at the day that everything changes. Or in our alternate timeline, doesn't. It's Thursday, December 1st, 1955. Rosa Parks finishes her shift at Montgomery Fair Department Store where she works as a seamstress. She's 42 years old, her feet hurt, and she just wants to get home. She boards the Cleveland Avenue bus around 6 p.m., pays her fare, and sits in the first row of the colored section, right behind the whites-only seats. The bus fills up as it rolls through downtown Montgomery. At the Empire Theater stop, several white passengers board. The driver, James F. Blake. The same driver who'd thrown Rosa off a bus 12 years earlier for not re-entering through the back door, notices a white man is standing. "Y'all better make it light on yourselves and let me have those seats," Blake announces. 3 other Black passengers get up and move. Rosa Parks stays seated. Blake walks back. "Are you going to stand up?" And here's where everything hinges. In our real timeline, Rosa looks up at him and says simply, "No." But what if she doesn't? What if, in that moment, the weight of everything crashes down on her? The knowledge of what happened to Claudette Cole then. The memory of Emmett Till, lynched just 3 months earlier for allegedly whistling at a white woman, his mutilated body still fresh in everyone's mind. The very real fear of what could happen to her, to Raymond, to her mother living with them. What if Rosa Parks feels her heart pounding, looks at that bus driver, and stands up. Let's explore what happens next. In our alternate December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks feels her hands trembling as she grips her purse. She thinks about Raymond, about her job, about the very real possibility of not just arrest but violence. She's not just any black woman in Montgomery. She's an NAACP secretary. She's known. And that makes her vulnerable. She stands up. She moves to the back of the bus. James Blake nods, satisfied, and returns to his seat. The white passenger sits down. Rosa stands in the back, swaying with the motion of the bus, her face burning with shame and rage. When she gets home that evening, she tells Raymond what happened. He holds her while she cries. Not tears of sadness, but of fury at herself, at the system, at everything. She goes to bed that night replaying the moment over and over. Why didn't I stay seated? Why didn't I? But here's the thing. The movement doesn't just disappear because Rosa Parks had a moment of human fear. The NAACP is still looking for a test case. E.D. Nixon is still strategizing. The black community of Montgomery is still fed up with daily humiliations on those buses. The economic power of the black community, making up the majority of bus riders, is still there, waiting to be wielded. The question becomes, when does the spark finally ignite? And more importantly, will it have the same power? December passes. Then January. The Montgomery NAACP keeps waiting for the right case, the right person, the right moment. But something has shifted. Rosa Parks is quieter now, more withdrawn. The guilt eats at her. She throws herself into her work with the NAACP, almost as if she's trying to compensate for that one moment of hesitation. E.D. Nixon is getting impatient. He knows the community is ready. He can feel it in the barbershops, the churches, the beauty salons. People are tired, but they need a catalyst, something to rally around. In February 1956, it almost happens. A young woman named Mary Louise Smith is arrested for refusing to give up her seat. But Mary's father is rumored to be an alcoholic, and once again, the NAACP leadership hesitates. Is she respectable enough? Will the white press use her family against the movement? They let the moment pass. Here's what's happening in our alternate 1956 that's different from the real timeline. Momentum is slipping. In the real world, the Montgomery bus boycott began on December 5, 1955, just 4 days after Rosa's arrest. Churches mobilized immediately. 40,000 black citizens stayed off the buses for 381 days, crippling the bus company financially and capturing national attention. But in our timeline, that electrical moment of unity never happens. The community stays fragmented, waiting for leadership that keeps saying, "Not yet, not yet." Meanwhile, something else is brewing. Let's talk about context, because history doesn't happen in a vacuum. 3 months before Rosa Parks's famous bus ride in our real timeline, 14-year-old Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi. His mother, Mamie Till, made the gutting decision to have an open casket funeral, forcing America to see what racism had done to her son. Jet magazine published the photos. Tens of thousands of people filed past that casket in Chicago. The Till case was a gut punch to Black America. It radicalized a generation. And it was still raw, still fresh, when Rosa Parks refused to move on December 1st. In our alternate timeline, the Till case still happens. History doesn't erase that horror. But without the immediate catalyst of Rosa Parks's arrest and the Montgomery bus boycott, that anger has nowhere to focus itself. It simmers instead of exploding. The NAACP continues its legal strategy, chipping away at segregation through the courts. The Brown v. Board of Education decision from 1954 is still on the books, declaring school segregation unconstitutional. But implementation, that's moving at a glacial pace, especially in the Deep South where massive resistance is the order of the day. Without Montgomery, there's no blueprint for mass nonviolent resistance. There's no proof that it can work. Now, here's where our alternate timeline gets really interesting, because there's a 26-year-old Baptist preacher in Montgomery who, in the real timeline, became the face of the bus boycott. His name is Martin Luther King Jr. In January 1955, King had just arrived in Montgomery to pastor Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He was young, ambitious, highly educated with a Ph.D. from Boston University, but relatively unknown outside his congregation. When Rosa Parks was arrested in the real timeline, E.D. Nixon specifically chose King to lead the boycott partly because he was new. He hadn't been in town long enough to make enemies or accumulate political debts. The Montgomery bus boycott made Martin Luther King Jr. into Martin Luther King Jr. But in our alternate timeline, where Rosa stands up and moves to the back of the bus, King is still just a local pastor. He's preaching powerful sermons, yes. He's starting to make a name for himself in Montgomery's black community. But he doesn't have a movement to lead. He doesn't have that crucible that forged him into a national leader. So what's he doing instead? King is restless. He's watching the slow pace of change and wondering if the NAACP's legal strategy is enough. He's reading about Gandhi's nonviolent resistance in India. He's developing his philosophy, but he has no proving ground. In our timeline, spring 1956 finds Martin Luther King Jr. still in Montgomery, but he's one voice among many, not yet the voice of a generation. And here's the brutal truth. Without that platform, without that moment, someone else might rise to fill that vacuum. Or maybe no one does. Maybe the civil rights movement fragments into a dozen smaller efforts instead of coalescing into the massive force it became. Let's zoom out for a second and look at what's actually at stake here. In the real timeline, the Montgomery bus boycott wasn't just about buses. It was a masterclass in economic pressure, community organizing, and nonviolent resistance. Black domestic workers walked miles to clean white people's homes. Churches organized carpool systems with military precision. People sacrificed for more than a year, and they won. On November 13, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that Alabama's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. That victory rippled outward. It proved that ordinary people, organized and committed, could challenge Jim Crow and win. It created a model that would be replicated in sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches across the South. But in our alternate timeline, none of that happens. At least not yet, not in that way. So what fills the void? Without the success of Montgomery, the civil rights movement might take a more militant turn, faster. There's a young man named Malcolm X who's gaining influence in the Nation of Islam, preaching black nationalism and self-defense. In the real timeline, Malcolm and Martin represented two different approaches. Malcolm's more confrontational style versus Martin's nonviolent resistance. But they also respected each other, and eventually, their philosophies started to converge before Malcolm's assassination. In our alternate timeline, without Martin Luther King Jr. emerging as the face of nonviolent resistance through Montgomery, Malcolm's message might dominate earlier. The movement might become more fragmented, more regional, more willing to embrace armed self-defense as its primary strategy rather than nonviolent protest. Is that better or worse? That's not for me to judge. But it's definitely different. Our alternate timeline rolls forward to September 1957. This event happens in both timelines. 9 black students attempt to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. You've probably seen the photos. 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford walking alone, head high, through a screaming mob of white protesters. The Arkansas National Guard, ordered by Governor Orville Faubus, blocking the students from entering. Eventually, President Eisenhower has to send in the 101st Airborne Division to escort the Little Rock Nine into school. These students were heroes. They endured a year of unspeakable abuse, verbal harassment, physical attacks, acid thrown in their faces. But they persevered, and their courage captured national attention. Here's the question for our alternate timeline. Does Little Rock have the same impact without Montgomery preceding it? In the real timeline, Montgomery had already proven that sustained, organized resistance could work. It had elevated Martin Luther King Jr. to national prominence, and he used that platform to support the Little Rock Nine. The infrastructure of the civil rights movement, the networks, the media attention, the sense of momentum, was already building. In our alternate timeline, Little Rock happens in more of a vacuum. Yes, it's still covered by the media. Yes, it's still shocking. But without Montgomery as proof of concept, without that recent victory to point to, the Little Rock Nine might feel more isolated. The white backlash might be even fiercer because there's no counterbalancing narrative of successful integration. And here's the really dark possibility. Without the momentum of Montgomery, does President Eisenhower act as quickly to send in federal troops? Does he calculate that the political cost is too high? Let's say, for our timeline, that Eisenhower does eventually act, but more slowly, more reluctantly. The delay costs days, maybe weeks, of additional trauma for those 9 students. Let's check back in with Rosa Parks in our alternate 1957. She's still in Montgomery. She's still working with the NAACP. But she's watching history unfold differently than it might have, and the weight of "what if" is crushing her. She sees the Little Rock Nine on television, and she thinks, that could have been the momentum we started in Montgomery. She hears about Malcolm X gaining followers with his message that black people need to defend themselves by any means necessary, and she wonders, if we'd shown that nonviolence could work, would as many people be drawn to his message? Rosa Parks, in our timeline, carries a secret burden that no one else fully understands. Raymond knows. He sees it in her eyes. Some nights, she confesses to him, "I should have stayed in that seat. I should have been braver." And Raymond, bless him, tells her what she needs to hear. Baby, courage isn't the absence of fear. And one moment doesn't define a whole life. You're still fighting. You're still here. But Rosa can't shake it. In the real timeline, Rosa Parks became an icon, yes, but she also paid a heavy price. She and Raymond both lost their jobs because of her activism, and they eventually moved to Detroit to start over. But she had the solace of knowing her stand mattered, that it changed everything. In our timeline, she has only the gnawing question, what if I had been braver? February 1st, 1960. 4 black college students, Azell Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil, walk into a Woolworth's in Greensboro, North Carolina. They buy some school supplies, then sit down at the whites-only lunch counter and order coffee. They're refused service. They stay seated. They remain nonviolent, polite, dignified, and they don't leave until the store closes. The Greensboro sit-ins happen in both timelines. Within weeks, the movement spreads like wildfire. Nashville, Atlanta, Richmond. Thousands of students, mostly black but some white allies too, sit at segregated lunch counters across the South. They're cursed at, spat on, beaten, arrested. But they keep coming back. This is the moment when a new generation takes the lead. These students weren't waiting for permission from the older civil rights organizations. They formed their own group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. But here's the critical difference in our alternate timeline. They don't have Montgomery as their North Star. In the real world, the students who led the sit-ins had grown up watching the Montgomery bus boycott unfold. They'd seen grainy footage of peaceful protesters being arrested. They'd seen Martin Luther King Jr. emerge as a moral voice arguing that nonviolent resistance wasn't weakness, it was strength. Montgomery gave them a playbook and a philosophy. In our alternate timeline, the sit-ins still happen because the students' frustration is real and their courage is genuine. But the movement is more chaotic, less organized. There's no clear philosophical framework beyond, we're tired of being treated like second-class citizens. Some sit-ins remain nonviolent. Others, when violence breaks out, see protesters fighting back. There's debate within the movement. Is nonviolence a deeply held principle or just a tactic? Without King's moral authority established through Montgomery, the answer isn't as clear. The sit-ins still grab national attention. They still result in some desegregation victories. But the movement is messier, more fractured. And the white backlash is fiercer because there's no countervailing narrative of dignified, unshakable nonviolence. May 1961. In both timelines, 13 activists, 7 black, 6 white, board 2 buses in Washington, D.C. headed for the Deep South. They're freedom riders, testing a Supreme Court ruling that declared segregated interstate bus terminals unconstitutional. They're hoping to force the federal government to enforce the law. What they get is violence. In Anniston, Alabama, 1 bus is firebombed. The riders barely escape before it explodes. In Birmingham, The other group is attacked by a mob with metal pipes and baseball bats. Police Commissioner Bull Connor has given the Ku Klux Klan 15 minutes to attack before police will respond. The photos of that burning bus, the beaten riders, they shock the nation in both timelines. But here's where our timelines diverge again. In the real world, Martin Luther King Jr. and the infrastructure built during Montgomery mobilized quickly. More Freedom Riders volunteered. Churches provided support. The movement had experienced organizers who knew how to channel outrage into sustained action. In our alternate timeline, the Freedom Rides happen, but the response is more disorganized. King exists, but he's a respected preacher, not a nationally known leader with a proven track record. The volunteers still come, driven by their conscience and courage, but there's less coordination, less strategic thinking. And here's the darker possibility. Without the proven success of nonviolent mass action for Montgomery, more people in the movement start arguing that self-defense isn't just acceptable, it's necessary. When mobs attack, some Freedom Riders start carrying weapons. When one group fights back and survives, it becomes harder to argue for total nonviolence. The movement starts splitting faster than it did in real history. President Kennedy, in both timelines, is trying to walk a tightrope. He needs Southern white votes, but he's also seeing international embarrassment as the Soviet Union uses American racism as propaganda. In our timeline, he acts, but more tentatively, with less pressure from a unified, strategically savvy civil rights movement. The Interstate Commerce Commission still desegregates bus terminals by November 1961. That victory happens in both timelines. But it feels less like the result of a powerful, organized movement and more like a grudging concession to chaos. August 28, 1963. In the real timeline, this is one of the most important days in American history. 250,000 people gather at the Lincoln Memorial. They've come from every corner of America. Black, white, young, old, celebrities and ordinary citizens. Joan Baez sings. John Lewis, barely 23 years old, gives a fiery speech. And then Martin Luther King Jr. steps to the podium and delivers, "I Have a Dream." That speech becomes the defining articulation of the civil rights movement. King's vision of his children being judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. His dream of former slaves and former slave owners sitting together at the table of brotherhood. His refusal to allow the movement to degenerate into bitterness and hatred. It's brilliant. It's powerful. And it happens because King has spent nearly 8 years, since Montgomery, honing his message and building his platform. In our alternate timeline, there is a march on Washington in 1963. Philip Randolph, the elder statesman who organized it in the real timeline, still organizes it here. People still come. But it's smaller. Maybe 100,000 instead of 250,000. And there's no singular voice, no unifying vision. King speaks, and he's eloquent, but he's one of many speakers without the moral authority earned through leading successful campaigns. The march makes news, but it doesn't capture the nation's imagination the same way. More importantly, it doesn't put the same pressure on Congress to pass comprehensive civil rights legislation. Let's talk about what's happening in the real timeline versus ours as 1963 rolls into 1964. In the real world, the March on Washington, combined with years of strategic campaigns, photographs of police dogs and fire hoses turned on children in Birmingham, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church that killed 4 little girls, all of it created undeniable momentum. President Kennedy proposed comprehensive civil rights legislation before his assassination in November 1963, and President Lyndon Johnson pushed it through Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed on July 2nd. It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It ended segregation in public places. It banned employment discrimination. It was a watershed moment. In our alternate timeline, Kennedy still proposes civil rights legislation. The pressure is there, just not as overwhelming. But when he's assassinated, and Johnson takes over, the political calculation is different. Johnson is still a skilled legislator who wants to secure his legacy, but without the massive, organized pressure from a unified civil rights movement, he moves more slowly. The Civil Rights Act still passes in our timeline, But maybe it's 1965 instead of 1964. Maybe it's been watered down more in compromises. Maybe the enforcement mechanisms are weaker. A year's delay doesn't sound like much. But think about what that means for real people. That's another year of legal segregation. Another year of being turned away from restaurants, hotels, jobs. Another year of indignity and danger. And here's the compounding effect. Every delay, every weakened law, every compromise means the next fight is harder. March 7, 1965. Bloody Sunday. In both timelines, 600 marchers attempt to walk from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, to demand voting rights. They're protesting the systematic disenfranchisement of black voters through literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright violence. They make it to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And then Alabama state troopers attack them with billy clubs and tear gas. John Lewis's skull is fractured. Amelia Boynton is beaten unconscious. The images, broadcast on national television, horrify the country. This happens in both timelines because the fight for voting rights is bigger than any one person. But again, the response differs. In the real world, Martin Luther King Jr. immediately calls for clergy and activists from across the nation to come to Selma. Thousands respond. The march eventually happens under federal protection, and the pressure leads to the Voting Rights Act being signed on August 6, 1965, one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. In our alternate timeline, activists still come to Selma after Bloody Sunday, but the mobilization is slower, less coordinated. The Voting Rights Act still passes. The images from Selma are too powerful for Congress to ignore, but maybe it takes longer. Maybe it's 1966 instead of 1965. And here's what a lot of people don't realize. The Voting Rights Act required reauthorization. It had to be renewed by Congress periodically. A weaker original law, passed with less momentum behind it, is easier to chip away at in the decades to come. In fact, in our real timeline, key provisions of the Voting Rights Act were struck down by the Supreme Court in 2013. Imagine how much more vulnerable it would be in our alternate timeline where it was weaker to begin with. By the mid-1960s in our alternate timeline, the civil rights movement is achieving legal victories, but they're coming slower and they feel less complete. And the younger generation is getting impatient. Stokely Carmichael coins the term Black Power in both timelines, but in our world, it gains traction faster. Without the clear success of nonviolent mass action established early on through Montgomery, more activists are drawn to Malcolm X's message before his assassination in 1965, and to the Black Panthers after their founding in 1966. The Black Panthers started as a community organization providing free breakfast for children and monitoring police brutality. But they also openly carried weapons and talked about armed self-defense. In the real timeline, they existed alongside the nonviolent movement. In our timeline, they might become more dominant, more quickly. Urban uprisings, Watts in 1965, Newark and Detroit in 1967, and over 100 cities after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in 1968, these all still happen. The desperation, the poverty, the police brutality that sparked them exist in both timelines. But the national response might be different. Without the stark contrast between King's nonviolence and urban unrest, white moderate support for civil rights might erode faster. Richard Nixon's Law and Order campaign in 1968 might be even more effective. Here's the tragic irony. Rosa Parks, watching all of this unfold on television in Detroit, because yes, she and Raymond still likely move there looking for work, sees a movement that's achieving things, but more slowly, more painfully, with more bloodshed. And she still wonders, what if? Let's fast forward through the decades and see how our alternate timeline continues to diverge. The 1970s arrive, and legally, on paper, America has changed. The Civil Rights Act exists. The Voting Rights Act exists. Schools are supposed to be integrated. But implementation is the real battle, and without the strong foundation of Montgomery, enforcement is weaker. In the real timeline, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, but his legacy, the organizations he built, the philosophy he articulated, the network of trained activists, continued shaping the movement. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, formed after Montgomery, remained a powerful force. In our alternate timeline, King's assassination in 1968 still happens. He was speaking out against the Vietnam War and for economic justice, which made him a target regardless. But his death creates less of a unified mourning, less of a galvanizing moment, because he never became quite as central a figure to American consciousness. Instead, the 1970s see the civil rights movement more fragmented. There's the NAACP continuing its legal work. There's the Black Panther Party, more influential in our timeline, being systematically dismantled by SOINTELPRO, the FBI's program to infiltrate and disrupt activist organizations. There are local leaders, community organizers, activists fighting battles in 1,000 cities. Progress continues, but it's more scattered, less coordinated. Affirmative action policies are still implemented, but they face fiercer backlash and less solid legal footing. The Bakke decision in 1978, where the Supreme Court ruled on reverse discrimination, might go differently without the strong civil rights legal precedents built on Montgomery's momentum. Here's what this means practically: fewer black students in universities, fewer black professionals entering fields like law, medicine, and business. The black middle class grows, but more slowly. And voting rights? Without the strong Voting Rights Act of our real timeline, and without the infrastructure to fight every attempt to chip away at it, voter suppression tactics in the South are rolled back more slowly. Literacy tests might linger longer. Redistricting to dilute black voting power faces less organized resistance. By the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan is president and conservatism is ascendant, the rollback of civil rights protections accelerates. In our real timeline, there was fierce resistance to Reagan's attempts to weaken civil rights enforcement. In our alternate timeline, that resistance is less organized, less effective. Let's check in one more time with Rosa Parks. In our real timeline, Rosa lived until 2005. She spent her later years as a living symbol of courage, though she struggled financially and faced health problems. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Congressional Gold Medal. 40,000 people filed past her casket when she died, lying in honor at the U.S. Capitol, the first woman to receive that distinction. In our alternate timeline, Rosa is still in Detroit. She's still active in civil rights work, still attending events, still speaking to young people. But she's not an icon. She's a respected elder, yes, but not the Rosa Parks of history books. And that guilt? It never fully leaves her. Imagine being in her position. You watch the news in 1963 and see the March on Washington with no singular, galvanizing moment. You watch the struggle for voting rights take longer, cost more lives. You watch the movement fragment in the 1970s. You watch progress come more slowly than it might have. And or at least you believe, that if you'd been braver on that one evening in December 1955, things might have been different. Raymond passes away in our alternate timeline, just as he did in real life in 1977. At his funeral, Rosa breaks down, and she confesses to a close friend, "I failed him. I failed everyone. I had one moment that mattered, and I let fear win." Her friend tries to comfort her. "Rosa, you've spent your whole life fighting. That's what matters." But Rosa can't accept that, because she knows what courage looks like. She saw it in Claudette Cole then, in the Little Rock Nine, in the Freedom Riders, in thousands of nameless activists who risked everything. And she believes she fell short when it counted most. Here's the thing about alternate history. We're not just exploring what would happen to society. We're exploring what would happen to a human soul carrying that weight. Now let's zoom all the way out and look at how our alternate timeline shapes the world we'd be living in today, in 2025. First, politics. In the real timeline, the civil rights movement fundamentally realigned American politics. The Democratic Party's embrace of civil rights caused white Southern Democrats to flee to the Republican Party, the Southern strategy that defined politics for decades. Barack Obama's election in 2008 was a direct descendant of the movement that began in Montgomery. In our alternate timeline, that realignment still happens, but the timeline is different, messier. Without Montgomery as a clear inflection point, the shift takes longer. The Democratic Party moves more tentatively on civil rights. The Republican Party's Southern strategy is less about reaction to a unified civil rights movement and more about exploiting a general sense of racial anxiety. The Congressional Black Caucus, founded in 1971, exists in both timelines but might be smaller, less influential in our alternate version. Black political power grows, but more slowly. Now here's the big question. Does Barack Obama become president? In the real world, Obama's political rise was built on the infrastructure, the narrative, and the progress of the civil rights movement. He explicitly positioned himself as heir to that legacy. His campaign in 2008 mobilized young people and people of color in unprecedented numbers, partly by invoking the dream that began in Montgomery. In our alternate timeline, with a weaker civil rights legacy, less robust voting rights enforcement, and less black political power built up over decades, Obama's path to the presidency is significantly harder. Maybe he becomes a senator but not president. Maybe someone else breaks that barrier, but later, 2012, 2016, 2020. Or maybe, as of 2025 in our alternate timeline, America hasn't yet elected a black president. That's not a judgment on American society being inherently racist or not. It's recognition that political change requires infrastructure, momentum, and opportunity. And without Montgomery, that infrastructure is weaker. Let's talk about everyday life for Black Americans in our alternate 2025. In the real world, there's still enormous racial inequality. The wealth gap between Black and white families remains staggering. Incarceration rates for Black Americans are disproportionately high. Police brutality is still a crisis. Systemic racism didn't disappear just because the civil rights movement won legal victories. But, and this is crucial, things are better than they were in 1955. Not good enough, not where they should be, but measurably better. And a lot of that progress traces directly back to Montgomery. In our alternate timeline, without that early powerful success to build on, every gain comes harder and later. The Black middle class exists but is smaller. Educational opportunities for Black students are more limited. Employment discrimination faces less stringent enforcement. Here's a concrete example. In the real world, the percentage of Black Americans with college degrees increased from about 3% in 1960 to over 25% today. In our alternate timeline, maybe that figure is 18% or 20% in 2025. That might not sound like a huge difference, but that's hundreds of thousands of people whose life trajectories are different. Representation in media, in corporate leadership, in academia, all of it lags behind where it is in our real timeline. And criminal justice? In the real world, mass incarceration exploded after the 1970s, devastating Black communities. In our alternate timeline, with weaker civil rights protections and less organized resistance, it might be even worse. Or conversely, with more Black power advocates in positions of influence earlier, there might have been more effective pushback against the war on drugs. That's the tricky thing about alternate history. Once you change one major event, the ripples become unpredictable. Let's not forget that the American civil rights movement didn't just affect America. It inspired liberation movements around the world. In the real timeline, the Montgomery bus boycott and Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of nonviolent resistance influenced anti-apartheid activists in South Africa. Nelson Mandela studied the American civil rights movement. The Dalai Lama cited King as an inspiration. Pro-democracy movements from Eastern Europe to Asia looked to the American example. In our alternate timeline, without Montgomery as that shining example of successful nonviolent mass action, liberation movements worldwide develop differently. Maybe they embrace armed struggle more quickly. Maybe they're less effective. Maybe they find other models to follow. South Africa's anti-apartheid movement still succeeds. The internal contradictions of apartheid and international pressure were too great for it to survive indefinitely. But maybe it takes longer. Maybe it's bloodier. Maybe Nelson Mandela doesn't emerge as quite the same figure without King's example to point to. The Arab Spring, the Hong Kong protests, Black Lives Matter. All of these movements in our real timeline drew on tactics and strategies pioneered during the American Civil Rights Movement. In our alternate timeline, they developed different playbooks. And here's the really sobering thought. How many liberation movements failed in our real timeline that might have succeeded with the blueprint Montgomery provided? And how many might have succeeded in our alternate timeline who instead failed because they lacked that model? History isn't just about what happened. It's about what could have happened, and what those possibilities mean for understanding our world. Let's return one final time to Rosa Parks. In the real timeline, Rosa passed away on October 24, 2005. Her funeral was a national event. President Bush ordered flags flown at half-staff. Her casket lay in the Capitol Rotunda, viewed by thousands. She was celebrated as the mother of the civil rights movement, the woman whose quiet courage changed history. In our alternate timeline, Rosa passes away on the same day. We'll keep that consistent. But her funeral is smaller, more private. Local leaders speak. Friends and family mourn. The newspaper runs an obituary noting her long civil rights work. But there's no national mourning. No lying in state. Because in this timeline, she's not a symbol of courage. She's a symbol, at least to herself, of a moment of fear. Here's what's heartbreaking. In both timelines, Rosa Parks was a hero. In the real timeline, she's celebrated for one moment of incredible bravery. In our alternate timeline, she's forgotten for one moment of very human fear, but she spent the rest of her life fighting just as hard, sacrificing just as much. The difference isn't who Rosa Parks was. It's which moment we remember. And maybe that's the most important lesson from this entire exploration. Courage isn't a character trait you either have or don't have. It's a choice you make in specific moments, and sometimes you make the brave choice and sometimes you don't, and sometimes the consequences of those choices ripple through history in ways you can't imagine. Rosa Parks was always brave. In our timeline, she just wasn't brave at the moment that mattered most. Okay, let's come back to reality. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks did not stand up. She stayed seated. She looked at that bus driver and said, "No," and that single word changed the world. Within days, the Montgomery bus boycott began. Within a year, segregation on Montgomery buses ended. Within a decade, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act became law. Within our lifetime, America elected a black president. None of it was inevitable. Rosa Parks almost didn't do what she did. She said later that she was tired, not just physically tired, but tired of giving in. She thought about Emmett Till. She thought about her grandfather with his shotgun, refusing to bow. And she stayed seated. E.D. Nixon got the call about her arrest and knew immediately. This was the test case they'd been waiting for. Martin Luther King Jr., new to Montgomery and not yet 30 years old, agreed to lead the boycott. And together, they sparked a movement. But here's what often gets lost in the mythology. It almost didn't work. The boycott required incredible sacrifice. People walked miles to work every day for over a year. They were harassed, arrested. Their homes were bombed. King's house was firebombed with his wife and baby daughter inside. They survived. And even after they won, the struggle continued. The civil rights movement required thousands of people making daily choices to be courageous. Rosa Parks's moment was crucial, but it was only the beginning. So what's the point of this whole thought experiment? It's not to diminish Rosa Parks by imagining her failing. It's to understand how fragile progress really is. How much it depends on individuals finding courage in specific moments. How close we came to living in a very different world. In our real timeline, we still have enormous work to do on racial justice. But we're building on a foundation that includes Montgomery, the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and countless other victories that seemed impossible until people made them happen. Those victories weren't inevitable. They required people like Rosa Parks to be brave when it would have been so much easier to be afraid. And here's the thing that should terrify and inspire us in equal measure. Those moments are still happening. Right now, today, people are making choices that will ripple through history. Some of them will be brave. Some will falter. And we won't know which choices mattered most until years or decades later. That's the weight of history. It's not something that happens to us. It's something we make, moment by moment, choice by choice. Let me tell you something that Rosa Parks said years later, in an interview when she was already an icon, already immortalized in history books. The interviewer asked her, "Were you scared that day on the bus?" And Rosa, in her quiet, dignified way, said, "Yes, I was. But I was also tired of being scared." That's the truth that our alternate timeline helps us understand. Rosa Parks wasn't fearless. She was afraid. She knew what could happen to her. She'd seen it happen to others. Emmett Till had been murdered just months before. Claudette Cole then had been dragged off a bus. Black people who stood up to white authority in the South in 1955 often paid with their jobs, their homes, their freedom, sometimes their lives. Rosa Parks was terrified. And she stayed seated anyway. That's what courage actually is. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. In our alternate timeline, we imagined what would happen if that fear won. Not because Rosa Parks was weak, she spent her entire life fighting for justice. But because she was human, and humans sometimes falter in crucial moments. And what did we learn? That one moment of individual courage, or the lack of it, can change the trajectory of millions of lives across decades. That's the butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, and eventually a tornado forms in Texas. Rosa Parks stays in her seat, and eventually a nation transforms. But flip it around. Rosa Parks stands up and moves to the back, and that transformation gets delayed, weakened, fragmented. People still fight. Progress still happens. But slower, harder, at a higher cost. Let's put both timelines side by side and really understand what that one moment meant. Real timeline. December 1955. Montgomery bus boycott begins. 1956. Buses desegregated. Nonviolent resistance proven effective. 1963. March on Washington. 250,000 people. I have a dream. 1964. Civil Rights Act passes. 1965. Voting Rights Act passes. 2008. First black president elected. Alternate timeline. December 1955. Nothing happens. 1956 to 1960. Movement searches for a spark, fragments. 1963. Smaller march, no unifying voice. 1965. Civil Rights Act passes, weaker version. 1966. Voting Rights Act passes, delayed and compromised. 2025. Likely no black president yet. The difference. Years. Decades. Generations. Every year of delay in passing the Civil Rights Act meant another year of legal segregation. Another year of black children attending underfunded schools. Another year of families denied housing loans. Another year of workers facing employment discrimination with no legal recourse. Every delay in the Voting Rights Act meant more black citizens denied their fundamental right to vote. More political power remaining in the hands of those who wanted to maintain white supremacy. And all those delays compound. Education affects income. Income affects wealth. Wealth affects opportunity for the next generation. When you delay justice by 5 years, you're not just affecting people alive at that moment. You're affecting their children and grandchildren. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you're a black child born in 1955. In the real timeline, by the time you're 10 years old, the Civil Rights Act has passed. You grow up in a world where discrimination is illegal, even if enforcement is imperfect. You have opportunities your parents never had. In our alternate timeline, you're 15 before the Civil Rights Act passes. Those 5 extra years of your childhood are shaped by legal segregation. The schools you attend, the opportunities you're denied, the daily indignities you face, all of it stays with you for life. Multiply that by millions of people, and you begin to understand the true cost of delay. But this isn't just a story about Rosa Parks. It's a story about all of us. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We all face our own bus moments. Maybe not as historically significant, maybe not with millions of lives hanging in the balance, but moments where we have a choice between courage and fear. The coworker being harassed, and you can speak up or stay silent. The injustice you witness, and you can get involved or look away. The principle you believe in, and you can stand for it or compromise it. We like to think we'd be brave. We imagine ourselves as Rosa Parks, staying seated, looking that bus driver in the eye and saying, "No." But would we? In that moment, feeling the fear, knowing the cost, would we really? That's what our alternate timeline forces us to confront. Rosa Parks was extraordinary not because she was superhuman, but because she was fully human and chose courage anyway. And here's the thing. She didn't know it would work. She didn't know that her arrest would spark a boycott, that the boycott would launch a movement, that the movement would change a nation. She couldn't see the butterfly effect. She just knew it was right to stay seated, even if it cost her everything. That's faith. That's courage. That's what changes history. Let's talk about something important. Rosa Parks became famous, but she wasn't alone. There were thousands of people who made the Montgomery bus boycott work. The women who organized carpools. The men who drove people to work before dawn. The families who walked miles every day for 381 days. The church leaders who risked their buildings being bombed. The lawyers who fought the case for free. In the real timeline, we remember Rosa Parks. But do we remember Joe and Robinson, who printed and distributed 35,000 leaflets calling for the boycott? Do we remember Virginia Durr, the white woman who bailed Rosa out of jail? Do we remember the thousands whose names we'll never know? And in our alternate timeline, where Rosa stood up and moved, would those people have found another moment to be brave? We said yes, probably, eventually. But how many potential heroes never got their moment because the circumstances never aligned? History isn't made by lone heroes. It's made by thousands of people choosing courage in small and large ways, and sometimes those choices align into something bigger than anyone could have planned. Rosa Parks's moment mattered enormously. But it only mattered because thousands of other people were ready to follow her example, to sacrifice alongside her, to turn one act of defiance into a sustained movement. That's what our alternate timeline really shows. It's not just about one person's courage or fear. It's about how individual moments of bravery or hesitation can enable or prevent collective action. So what do we owe Rosa Parks? What do we owe all the people, famous and forgotten, who chose courage when fear would have been easier? We owe them truth. Not the sanitized version where Rosa Parks was just a tired seamstress who spontaneously took a stand. She was a trained activist who made a strategic choice knowing full well the consequences. We owe them recognition of the cost. Rosa and Raymond Parks lost their jobs. They received death threats. They eventually had to leave Alabama entirely and start over in Detroit. Rosa struggled financially for much of the rest of her life. Courage isn't free. We owe them continued commitment to the work. The civil rights movement won crucial battles, but the war isn't over. Racial inequality persists. Voting rights are still under attack. The dream Martin Luther King Jr. articulated at the March on Washington remains unfulfilled. But most of all, we owe them our own courage. We owe them our willingness to face our own bus moments and choose bravery over fear. Because here's the final lesson from our alternate timeline. Progress is never inevitable. It requires people to make it happen. And every generation faces the choice of whether to push forward or slide backward. Rosa Parks didn't know she was changing history. She just knew she was tired of accepting injustice. And that was enough. So let's return to where we started. December 1st, 1955. A bus in Montgomery, Alabama. A driver demanding that a black woman give up her seat. And a moment of decision that would ripple through time. In the world we actually live in, Rosa Parks said no. And because she said no, Martin Luther King Jr. had a movement to lead. And because King had a movement to lead, he articulated a dream that inspired millions. And because millions were inspired, laws were changed, barriers were broken, and a nation slowly, painfully, incompletely began to live up to its ideals. It wasn't magic. It wasn't inevitable. It was the result of one woman finding courage in a crucial moment, and thousands of others choosing to join her. In our alternate timeline, we imagine that courage faltering. Not to diminish Rosa Parks, but to understand how much that moment mattered. To see how fragile progress really is. To recognize that the difference between the world we have and the world we might have had often comes down to individual choices in specific moments. Rosa Parks was tired on December 1st, 1955. Tired of working all day for little pay. Tired of the daily indignities of segregation. Tired of being afraid. And so she stayed seated, and in staying seated, she stood up for something bigger than herself. That's the weight of a moment. That's the power of individual courage. That's how history actually changes, not through inevitable forces or grand historical narratives, but through human beings deciding that enough is enough, that today is the day, that fear will not win. We all have our December 1st. We all have our bus. The question is, when that moment comes, what will we choose? Rosa Parks chose courage. And because of that choice, millions of lives were changed, a nation was transformed, and a woman who just wanted to get home after work became immortal. That's not the end of the story. That's the beginning. Because the work continues, and new moments of decision come every day. The question is, what will we do with ours? Before we close, I want you to sit with something for a moment. Imagine you're Rosa Parks on the evening of December 1st, 1955, after you've been arrested and bailed out. You're at home, still shaken. You don't know yet that E.D. Nixon is organizing a boycott. You don't know that a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. will lead it. You don't know that your name will be in history books, that schools will be named after you, that your courage will inspire millions. All you know is that you stood up for yourself, or rather, stayed seated, and it cost you. You were arrested, fingerprinted, photographed like a criminal. You might lose your job. You might face violence. Your husband might face violence. And sitting there in your living room, terrified but also somehow at peace, you think, I did the right thing. Even if nothing comes of it. Even if I'm the only one who ever knows. I did the right thing. That's the moment. That's the choice. Not knowing if it will matter. Not knowing if anyone will remember. Just knowing it's right. And then, beyond your wildest dreams, it matters more than you could have imagined. That's the story of Rosa Parks. That's the story of the Montgomery bus boycott. That's the story of the civil rights movement. But it's also the story of every person who chooses courage over fear, who does the right thing even when it's hard, who stands up, or stays seated, for justice. We don't know which of our moments will echo through history. We don't know which small acts of courage will inspire others, which ripples will become waves. We just have to be brave. We just have to do what's right. And we have to trust that it matters, even if we never see how. Rosa Parks trusted. And she was right to trust. So the next time you face your moment, and you will face it, remember Rosa Parks. Remember the bus. Remember the choice. And then make the brave one. Thank you for watching. If this video made you think, made you feel something, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating what-ifs. Because understanding what could have been helps us appreciate what is, and inspires us to shape what will be. See you next time.